There is a silence around you right now that feels heavier than words can explain, and maybe you have been trying to understand it. Maybe you have been asking why the phone stopped ringing, why certain people slowly disappeared, why doors that once seemed open suddenly closed without warning, why conversations that once felt natural now feel distant and unfamiliar. And in the middle of all this quiet, you started wondering if something went wrong, if you made a mistake, if God stepped back, if heaven somehow forgot your name. But what if the silence you are experiencing is not absence at all? What if the silence is actually evidence that something sacred is happening behind the scenes, something precise, something intentional, something so carefully designed that it cannot be rushed or interrupted? Because the truth most people never realize until much later is that God often does His greatest work in the quietest seasons of your life, when nothing looks like it is changing on the outside, but everything is shifting underneath the surface in ways your eyes cannot yet see and your heart cannot yet fully understand. And that is exactly where you are standing right now, in a moment that feels still on the outside but is alive with movement in the spirit. Because silence has never meant emptiness in God's kingdom. Silence has always meant preparation. Silence has always meant positioning. Silence has always meant protection. And the reason this season feels different from the others you have survived before is because this silence is not random. This silence is not punishment. This silence is not delay. This silence is alignment, and alignment always feels unfamiliar before it feels comfortable, because alignment requires separation from what once felt normal. And God will sometimes remove noise from your life, not to isolate you but to help you hear Him more clearly than you ever have before. And maybe that explains why certain distractions suddenly lost their appeal, why conversations that once entertained you now feel exhausting, why environments that once welcomed you now feel uncomfortable, why you no longer fit in spaces that used to feel like home. Because when God begins preparing something significant for your future, He first creates space around your present, and that space often feels like silence before it feels like purpose. But what you are experiencing right now is not a sign that your life is slowing down, it is a sign that your life is being redirected in ways you cannot measure yet, because divine movement rarely announces itself with noise. Divine movement usually arrives wrapped in stillness, wrapped in patience, wrapped in moments that look ordinary but carry extraordinary meaning. And the reason heaven trusts you with this silent season is because God knows what He placed inside you requires protection before revelation, requires preparation before promotion, requires shaping before showing. And there are things being arranged right now that you cannot see. Because if you could see everything too early, you might try to control what was never meant to be controlled, or rush what was never meant to be rushed, or question what was always meant to be trusted. And sometimes the greatest evidence that God is working is not what He shows you but what He chooses not to show you yet. Because mystery is not rejection, mystery is mercy, and silence is not distance, silence is direction. And even though part of you wishes for answers, part of you wishes for confirmation, part of you wishes for movement that feels visible and immediate, there is another part of you deep inside that already senses something sacred is happening, something quiet but powerful, something invisible but undeniable, something slow but unstoppable. Because God does not waste silence, and He does not create empty seasons, and He does not allow stillness without purpose. And if your life feels quieter than usual right now, it is not because your story stopped, it is because your story is turning in a direction That requires focus, that requires clarity, that requires separation from voices that cannot go where you are being led next, and that kind of transition always begins with silence before it begins with revelation, because God prepares environments before He reveals outcomes, and right now your environment is being prepared in ways that cannot happen while everything stays loud and crowded and familiar and comfortable, because comfort has never been the birthplace of transformation, and noise has never been the birthplace of clarity, and distraction has never been the birthplace of destiny. And the silence you are standing inside today is not empty space, it is sacred ground, and sacred ground always feels different before it feels meaningful, always feels unfamiliar before it feels necessary, always feels confusing before it feels intentional. But one day, very soon, you are going to look back at this exact season and realize the quiet you once questioned was actually the protection you needed. The distance you once feared was actually the guidance you were praying for, and the silence you once misunderstood was actually the evidence that God trusted you enough to prepare you privately before revealing you publicly, because everything valuable in your life has always followed that pattern: preparation before presentation, shaping before showing, silence before significance. And what feels like nothing right now is actually everything, working together in ways your future will one day thank God for again and again and again. There are moments in your life when nothing around you seems to move forward, and you begin to wonder if heaven has gone silent over your name. But what you cannot see is that silence is often the language God uses when He is building something too powerful to be explained too early, because if He showed you everything He was preparing right now, your faith would turn into sight, and your dependence would turn into certainty, and certainty does not grow spiritual strength the way waiting does, which is why the season you are in is not empty. It is sacred, not forgotten, but protected, not delayed, but designed, because God never wastes silence. He uses it to separate you from voices that were confusing your direction. He uses it to pull you away from people who were slowly weakening your purpose. He uses it to reposition your heart so that when the blessing finally arrives, you will recognize it immediately and not trade it for something temporary again. And maybe this is why some doors closed without explanation. Maybe this is why certain people stopped understanding you. Maybe this is why opportunities you thought were yours suddenly disappeared, because God was not punishing you, He was preserving you from a version of your future that was smaller than what He promised. And while you were asking why things were slowing down, God was making sure nothing rushed into your life before you were ready to carry it, because blessings that arrive too early often become burdens instead of breakthroughs, and God loves you too much to let that happen, which is why this quiet season is not proof that your prayers were ignored. It is proof that your prayers were heard at a level deeper than you realized, because heaven responds differently when your request is connected to destiny instead of comfort. And right now, God is not just answering what you asked for, He is preparing what you actually need, and that preparation always happens in silence first, because silence removes distractions. Silence removes comparison. Silence removes the pressure to perform for people who were never meant to witness your transformation. And when those distractions disappear, something powerful begins to happen inside you. Your confidence stops depending on validation, your peace stops depending on circumstances, and your hope stops depending on timelines, and instead it begins to depend completely on God. And that is the moment when everything starts changing, even if nothing around you looks different yet. Because the greatest miracles do not begin around you, they begin within you first, and once your heart becomes strong enough to carry what God planned for you, the external changes will begin to follow in ways you never expected, because what God is building for your life right now cannot be stopped by rejection, cannot be delayed by confusion, and cannot be destroyed by the mistakes you made earlier in your journey, since God already accounted for those mistakes before He called you forward, which means nothing you experienced surprised Him, and nothing you lost disqualified you, and nothing you are facing today is stronger than what He is preparing tomorrow. So if this season feels slower than usual, it is not because your story is ending, it is because your foundation is deepening, and strong foundations are always built underground, where nobody claps, nobody celebrates, and nobody even notices what is happening yet. That unseen work is exactly what allows tall structures to stand when storms arrive later, which means the silence you feel right now is not empty space, it is construction space, it is preparation space, it is alignment space, and God is carefully arranging people, opportunities, timing, and strength around you so precisely that when the moment finally comes, everything will connect in a way that makes you realize the waiting was never punishment, it was protection, and the confusion was never abandonment, it was direction, and the stillness was never weakness, it was positioning, because sometimes the strongest move God can make in your life is not opening a door immediately, but strengthening you until the door opens at the exact moment your confidence, your wisdom, and your faith are ready to walk through it without fear. And that is why you cannot measure this season by what you see, because what you see right now is only the surface, while heaven is working underneath the timeline you can track, preparing conversations you have not had yet, arranging connections you have not met yet, restoring strength you did not know you lost, and rebuilding dreams that once felt impossible again. And one day, very soon, you are going to look back at this quiet chapter and realize it was not the pause you feared, it was the turning point you needed, and everything that felt delayed was actually being delivered in a better way than you imagined, because God does His deepest work in silence before He reveals His loudest miracles in public. Folded hands, sparkles, and even now, while you are still wondering what is happening behind the scenes, heaven is already moving pieces into place for you in ways that cannot be reversed, cannot be interrupted, and cannot be taken away, because what God is preparing for your life in this silent season is not temporary help, it is permanent direction. And once it arrives, you will finally understand why nothing earlier was allowed to replace it. The emotional build, where the listener begins to understand that the silence they feared was never abandonment but alignment, never rejection but redirection, never emptiness but preparation. And now something inside them starts shifting, because they begin to realize that the very season they almost walked away from was the season heaven was using to rebuild their identity from the inside out. And what makes this moment powerful is that God does not usually announce transformation while it is happening, because transformation that is announced too early becomes performance instead of purpose. So while people around you kept asking why nothing was changing, and why doors were still closed, and why answers were delayed, and why opportunities seemed to disappear just when you thought they were yours, God was quietly protecting your future from timing that would have damaged it. Because sometimes what looks like a missed chance is actually a rescued destiny, and what looks like a closed door is actually a shield you didn't even know you needed. And this is the part most people never talk about, because they expect God's movement to be loud and obvious and dramatic, but some of His deepest miracles happen in silence, where nobody claps and nobody notices and nobody congratulates you. Yet everything about your future is being rearranged behind the scenes in ways your mind could never fully understand. And if you look closely at your life, you will start to see the evidence, because the People who left were not random losses but necessary releases. The plans that failed were not wasted effort but divine protection. The waiting that stretched longer than you expected was not punishment but positioning, and what you thought was delay was actually alignment happening slowly enough to make sure you would be ready when the blessing finally arrived. Because blessings that come before readiness often become burdens instead of breakthroughs, and God refuses to give you something that will destroy you just because you asked for it too early, which means the silence you are living through right now is not empty space but sacred construction space where foundations are being strengthened underneath your faith even while your emotions feel uncertain and your patience feels stretched and your confidence sometimes feels fragile. Yet the truth is that heaven never pauses without purpose and God never becomes quiet without intention and your story never slows down unless something deeper is being built beneath the surface, and this is why you must not interpret quiet seasons as forgotten seasons because silence is often where God does His most strategic work preparing conversations you haven't heard yet arranging meetings you haven't walked into yet shifting hearts you haven't encountered yet and opening pathways that didn't exist yesterday. And what makes this moment even more powerful is that while you were waiting for visible signs, God was already moving invisible pieces into position so that when the moment finally arrives it will not feel random, it will feel undeniable, because divine timing never arrives halfway prepared, it arrives fully arranged with details you could never have organized on your own. And that is why your silence has felt heavy sometimes because deep change always happens below the surface before it becomes visible above the surface. Just like roots grow underground long before branches reach the sky and just like seeds break open in darkness long before flowers appear in sunlight. And what you are experiencing right now is the breaking open stage of something greater than you expected, which means the discomfort you feel is not a signal to quit but a signal that growth is happening in places nobody else can see yet. And the reason this matters so much is because the future God is preparing for you cannot be carried by the version of you that existed before this silence began. Which means the waiting was never about punishment, it was about preparation, and the quiet was never about absence, it was about transformation. And maybe you didn't realize it at first, but your perspective has already started changing, your priorities have already started shifting, your boundaries have already started strengthening, and your ability to recognize what truly belongs in your life has already started becoming clearer. And those are not coincidences, those are confirmations that something inside you is being rebuilt so you can walk into what God planned without repeating what once hurt you. Because when God prepares you in silence, He is not only changing your circumstances, He is changing your capacity to receive what He is about to release. And this is why some relationships faded, some distractions disappeared, some opportunities quietly closed, and some plans slowly dissolved, because God was removing what would have competed with the assignment He placed over your life before you were even aware of it. And now, even though the silence still feels unfamiliar at times, there is something different about you, because you are starting to sense that the quiet is not empty anymore, it is meaningful and intentional and alive with movement you cannot yet see but can begin to feel. And that feeling is not imagination, it is alignment beginning to take shape around you in ways that will soon become visible in conversations that surprise you, doors that open naturally, and confirmations that arrive without forcing them. And when that moment comes, you will understand why the silence lasted as long as it did, because what is coming next required space that only silence could create, and strength that only waiting could build, and clarity that only distance from the wrong environment could provide. So if you are still standing in the quiet right now, do not mistake the stillness for stagnation, because what feels slow is actually strategic, what feels hidden is actually protected, and what feels delayed is actually being perfected for the exact moment your life is ready to receive it. And the truth is that God has never stopped working on your behalf, even for a single second, not during the confusion, not during the waiting, not during the nights when answers seemed far away, and not during the days when progress felt invisible. Because silence in God's timing is never the absence of movement, it is the presence of preparation and the evidence that something greater than you expected is already on its way toward you even now. There is a reason why the season you are walking through feels so quiet right now, because when God begins doing His deepest work inside a person, He often removes the noise, the applause, the distractions, and even the people who once surrounded you, not to punish you but to prepare you. Because transformation rarely happens in crowds, and destiny is almost always shaped in hidden places where only faith can survive and only trust can breathe. And I know there are moments when you wonder why doors that once opened easily now seem closed without explanation, why conversations became shorter, why support became weaker, why opportunities slowed down instead of speeding up. But what you could not see is that heaven was rearranging your path behind the scenes in ways no human mind could predict. Because sometimes God has to protect your future by limiting your present. Sometimes He has to silence the voices around you so you can finally hear His voice clearly. Sometimes He has to remove comfort so courage can finally rise inside you. And what feels like delay is often divine positioning. What feels like loneliness is often sacred preparation. What feels like being forgotten is actually being separated for something greater than what you asked for. Because the truth is, the strongest people are not built in easy seasons but in silent ones, where they learn to stand without approval, walk without applause, and believe without visible evidence. And right now, even though nothing around you seems to be changing, something powerful inside you is becoming stronger than ever before. Your patience is growing deeper, your faith is becoming steadier, your heart is becoming wiser, and your spirit is learning how to recognize God's timing instead of rushing ahead of it. Because there are blessings that only arrive when your character is ready to carry them, and there are opportunities that only appear when your mindset becomes strong enough to protect them, and that is exactly why this quiet season is not empty at all but full of invisible movement, full of hidden alignment, full of divine protection that is working in your favor even when you cannot see a single sign yet. Because heaven does not operate based on what is visible to people but on what is prepared for purpose, and what God is preparing for you right now cannot be interrupted by opinions, cannot be stopped by rejection, cannot be delayed by betrayal, because what He begins in silence He reveals with power. At the right moment, and when that moment arrives, you will suddenly understand why certain relationships faded, why certain plans failed, why certain expectations disappeared, because every closed door was not a loss but a redirection, and every quiet night was not abandonment but construction happening in places your eyes could never reach. And one day very soon you will look back at this silent season and realize it was not the place where your story paused but the place where your strength was built and your destiny quietly took shape behind the curtain of faith. And what makes this season even more powerful is the fact that while you were waiting for visible change, God was already shifting invisible things in your favor. Because heaven never pauses even when life feels still, and there are moments when you think nothing is happening simply because nothing dramatic is happening around you. But destiny rarely announces itself with noise at the beginning, and purpose almost always arrives quietly before it arrives publicly, and the truth is many people give up during this exact stage because they mistake silence for absence and delay for rejection. But what you are experiencing right now is not rejection at all, it is protection, it is positioning, it is preparation happening at a level deeper than emotions and stronger than circumstances, because God never removes something valuable from your life unless He is making space for something necessary. And sometimes what He is protecting you from is something you once prayed for, because He could already see what it would cost you later, and that is why certain connections ended without explanation, why certain plans changed without warning, why certain opportunities disappeared right before they seemed ready to open. Because not everything that looks right in the moment is right for your future, and not everything that feels like loss is actually loss when heaven is involved. And even though it may have felt confusing at first, the truth is God was quietly separating you from what could not walk with you into your next season, because there are environments that cannot support the version of you that you are becoming, and there are people who cannot understand the assignment placed on your life until after they see what God is about to do through you. And this is why your path has started to look different from what you expected, because your calling is different from what others assumed. And sometimes the clearest sign that God is preparing something extraordinary is when your journey stops looking ordinary, when your timing stops matching everyone else's timing, when your progress stops following predictable patterns and starts moving according to divine direction instead of human planning. Because what God is building in your life right now cannot be compared to anyone else's story and cannot be measured by anyone else's timeline. And even if nobody around you understands the quiet transformation happening inside you, heaven understands it completely, because every prayer you whispered when nobody was listening was heard, every tear you hid when nobody noticed was counted, every moment you kept believing when nothing made sense was strengthening something inside you that will soon carry you into a season of clarity, restoration, and unexpected breakthrough. And when that breakthrough finally becomes visible, people may think it happened suddenly, but you will know it was being prepared during every silent moment when faith was the only thing you had left to hold on to. Because what God is about to release into your life will not be random, it will not be temporary, and it will not be small. It will be the result of everything He has been quietly arranging behind the scenes while you kept walking forward even when the path ahead looked uncertain. And that is why this season is not the ending of your progress, but the turning point of your story, where unseen preparation begins to transform into undeniable movement and quiet faith begins to step into visible purpose that nobody will be able to ignore anymore. And now there is something powerful you must understand in this very moment, because what you are experiencing is not a delay that is meant to weaken you, but a sacred transition that is designed to prepare you for a level of life you have never walked in before. And while it may feel like nothing around you is changing, the truth is that everything inside you is being rebuilt in ways your eyes cannot yet measure. Because God does His deepest work where human applause cannot reach, and where distraction cannot interrupt the transformation He is carefully shaping within your spirit. And that is why this season feels quieter than usual and slower than expected, and sometimes even heavier than you thought you could carry. Yet what you are carrying right now is not pressure meant to crush you, but preparation meant to elevate you. Because before God releases visible victory, He always builds invisible strength. Before He opens the public door, He strengthens the private foundation. And Before He brings the right people into your life, He removes the ones who could never walk with you into your destiny, and that removal may have confused you at first and even hurt more than you admitted to anyone else, but heaven never subtracts something from your life without preparing to multiply something greater in its place. There are moments when you wondered if your prayers were heard at all, and nights when silence felt louder than answers. Yet what you did not realize is that heaven responds differently than the world responds, because when people ignore you they forget you, but when God becomes silent around you, He is working closer than ever before, shaping events you cannot yet see and aligning people you have not yet met and moving obstacles you never even knew existed, and this is why your story has not ended where others expected it to end, because your life is not being directed by coincidence but by divine intention, and what looks like stillness around you is actually movement in the unseen realm where God is positioning opportunities that will suddenly appear at the exact moment your faith is strong enough to recognize them. Some of the doors that stayed closed in your past were not punishments but protection. Some of the relationships that disappeared were not losses but redirections, and some of the waiting seasons you struggled through were not wasted time but sacred construction zones where your future foundation was being strengthened so it would not collapse under the weight of the blessings that are now closer than you think. Because God never sends a destiny that your spirit is not prepared to sustain, and right now you are stronger than you were before the silence began, even if you have not fully noticed the change yet, because endurance has quietly replaced fear and patience has quietly replaced frustration and faith has quietly replaced doubt. There is also something else happening that many people miss during seasons like this, and that is the way God begins to shift your vision before He shifts your circumstances, because once your perspective changes, your direction naturally follows, and once your direction changes, your future begins to unfold differently than anything you expected before. And this is why you are starting to feel a new kind of clarity rising inside you, even if nothing outside you has visibly changed yet, because clarity is always the first signal that transformation is already underway, and when clarity arrives it means confusion is losing its control over your decisions and fear is losing its influence over your steps. You may not realize it yet, but the quiet strength growing inside you right now is exactly what will carry you through the next door God is preparing to open for you, because the next season of your life will not require the same version of you that survived the last season. It will require a stronger heart, a clearer vision, and a deeper trust than you have ever walked with before. And that is exactly why this preparation season could not be rushed even when you wanted it to end quickly. Because heaven is not preparing you for something temporary but for something lasting, something meaningful, and something that will touch more lives than just your own. And as this transformation continues to unfold around you in ways both visible and invisible, you will begin to notice something remarkable happening inside your spirit, because the same silence that once felt heavy will start to feel peaceful, the same waiting that once felt frustrating will start to feel purposeful, and the same uncertainty that once made you question everything will begin to feel like anticipation instead of fear. Because when God is about to move in your life, He first changes how you experience the waiting before He changes what you are waiting for, and that shift is already beginning inside you right now, even if you cannot fully explain it yet, because what is coming next in your journey is not random, it is not accidental, and it is not delayed anymore. It is aligned, it is prepared, and it is closer than it has ever been before.